This is the Quiz Fix. I'm Cyril, that's Olivia. One true story per episode, one quiz at the end, because facts you tested on are facts you keep. Here we go. When people hear the word wilderness, they may picture a lonely mountain ridge, a grizzly bear, or a forest where the loudest sound is the wind in the trees. But in the United States, wilderness is also a legal idea. It is a category of protection. And that idea became law in 1964 with the Wilderness Act.
Right, and that's what makes the story so interesting. The law did not just say, quote, nature is nice. It drew a line in federal law and said some places should stay largely untrammeled by humans. That word, untrammeled, shows up in the Act itself, and it has a very specific meaning. Not controlled, not constrained, not heavily manipulated.
And that was a huge deal, because by the mid-20th century, the United States had already transformed so much land. Roads, dams, logging, mining, development, you name it. A lot of people thought every useful piece of land had a purpose if humans could find one.
But a growing conservation movement pushed back. They argued that some places had value precisely because they were not developed. Not as playgrounds, not as timber supplies, not as future subdivisions, just as wild places.
That argument had roots going back decades. Think of John Muir and the early preservation movement, or the creation of national parks. But the Wilderness Act was different. National parks could still include roads, lodges, and lots of visitor infrastructure. Wilderness protection was much stricter.
Exactly. The law created a formal national wilderness preservation system. It allowed Congress to designate certain federal lands as wilderness, and once land got that status, development was tightly limited. No permanent roads, no commercial enterprises, no motorized equipment, and no new structures except in narrow circumstances.
That level of protection did not happen overnight. The road to the law was long, and one of the central figures was Howard Zahniser, the executive secretary of the Wilderness Society.
Zahniser is such an important name here. He drafted and redrafted the bill for years. He kept refining the language because he understood that one poorly chosen word could weaken the whole thing. He was incredibly persistent.
And he was working in an era when the political odds were rough. Federal land management was often focused on multiple use, meaning timber, grazing, mining, recreation, and conservation all had to be balanced. That sounds reasonable in theory, but wilderness advocates worried that the wildest areas would always lose that balancing act.
So they made the case that there are places where balance should not mean compromise all the way down. Some areas needed a higher standard. Wilderness was the word they chose, and it ended up carrying a lot of moral force.
The bill also drew on a lot of public support from writers, scientists, hunters, anglers, hikers, and ordinary citizens who wanted future generations to experience untouched landscapes. It was not just a tree-hugger issue, if I can say that without sounding too 1960s.
You can say it, but let's also be fair. The coalition was broader than stereotypes suggest. Some supporters cared about solitude, some about wildlife, some about recreation, and some about the idea that a wealthy modern society should be able to leave something unspoilt.
There was also a major philosophical question underneath all of it. Do humans own the land, or do we hold it in trust? The Wilderness Act leaned hard towards stewardship.
And it defined wilderness in a memorable way. The law described wilderness as an area where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man, where man himself is a visitor who does not remain. That line is famous because it captures the whole spirit of the Act.
That phrase, man himself is a visitor who does not remain, really hits. It says, in effect, this place is not for our permanent occupation. We are passing through.
Though it is worth noting, the law was not about every acre of land in the country. It applied to federal lands and depended on Congress to designate specific wilderness areas. It is a system with rules, boundaries, and a lot of political negotiation.
And those negotiations were fierce. Some interests worried about lost access to timber, roads, or resource development. Others feared that wilderness designation would freeze land into a museum and lock out people entirely.
But supporters argued that wilderness was not a museum. It was living land, just protected from the most intrusive forms of use. People could still visit and hike there, but they were meant to experience it on nature's terms as much as possible.
The act was signed by President Lyndon B. Johnson on September 3, 1964. That was a big moment because it turned a long campaign into national policy.
And Johnson's signing statement was powerful. He talked about preserving a little more of our country so that future generations could know the thrill and wonder of unspoiled country. That message helped frame wilderness as a national inheritance.
The first designation under the Act included more than 9 million acres. That is a staggering amount, but it was still only a beginning.
Over time, Congress expanded the National Wilderness Preservation System many times. Today, the system includes more than 110 million acres of federal land. That makes it one of the most important land protection systems in the world.
It is easy to forget how controversial that kind of protection once was. Today, many Americans take wilderness for granted, as if it has always been there in law. But the Act had to win a real political fight.
And that fight required a lot of patience. Zahniser did not live to see the final signing. He died in May 1964, just months before the Act became law. That gives the story a bittersweet edge.
It does. He spent years shaping the bill, and then he did not get to see it become law. But his work endured. In a very real sense, the Act carries his fingerprints.
One reason the language has lasted is that it was carefully written to be durable. The Act sets out core principles and leaves room for Congress to designate lands case by case. That structure has helped the system survive legal and political changes.
And the idea of wilderness also influenced how Americans thought about public lands more broadly. It reinforced the notion that not every resource has to be extracted, sold, or built over.
That is a profound shift. In a country famous for growth, industry, and development, wilderness said some places are valuable because they remain difficult, quiet, and largely untouched.
There is also an ecological side. Wilderness areas help protect habitat, watersheds, biodiversity, and natural processes. Even if the Act was not written in today's climate language, it turned out to have major environmental importance.
Absolutely. Protecting large, intact landscapes supports species that need space and reduces fragmentation. And when rivers, forests, and alpine areas stay connected, ecosystems can function more naturally.
At the same time, wilderness policy has always involved trade-offs. Some indigenous communities have pointed out that the term wilderness can sometimes ignore the long human histories of these lands.
That is an important point, and it is widely recognized today. Many lands labelled wilderness were used, travelled, or shaped by native peoples long before federal designation. So while the Wilderness Act is a landmark conservation law, its history also sits inside a broader and more complicated story about land and displacement.
That complexity matters. The law was groundbreaking, but it was also a product of its time. Looking back honestly means celebrating the protection while also understanding whose voices were missing.
And that is part of why the Wilderness Act remains relevant. It forces us to ask what protection means, who gets to decide it, and how to preserve nature without pretending history is simple.
Another interesting thing is how the Act changed the language of conservation. Before 1964, people might talk about parks, forests, or refuges. Afterward, wilderness became a distinct category with real legal weight.
And that category has shaped public expectations ever since. If a place is designated wilderness, people know it is supposed to stay wild. That clarity is part of the Act's genius.
I also love that the law connects deeply to the American tradition of public lands. These are lands held by the federal government on behalf of the public, not private owners. The Wilderness Act says some of the public estate should remain especially wild.
That public trust idea is powerful. It suggests stewardship across generations, not just across election cycles. You protect a place not for the next quarter, but for the next century.
And in practical terms, the Act gave conservationists a legal tool they could actually use. It was not just idealism, it was enforceable policy.
Which matters because a lot of environmental history is the story of turning ideas into institutions. The Wilderness Act did exactly that. It took a moral argument and made it part of the machinery of government.
So, if you had to sum it up, the 1964 Wilderness Act was about saying that wilderness has value beyond money, convenience, or even ordinary recreation.
Yes. It said that some places should remain wild for their own sake and for the sake of the people who come after us. That is why it still feels inspiring.
And maybe that is the lasting lesson. Protecting wildland is not a rejection of civilization. It is a choice about what kind of civilization we want to be.
Well said. The Wilderness Act did not just save land, it saved an idea. And that idea continues to shape how Americans think about nature, responsibility, and legacy.
Today's episode is sponsored by Fyrebox. That's Fyrebox. Fyrebox is the no-code quiz platform trusted by marketers, teachers, and creators around the world. Whether you want to capture leads, run an assessment, or just engage your audience with something more interesting than a contact form, Fyrebox makes it easy. Start free at fyrebox.com. Welcome back. You just heard the story. Now let's see what's stuck. Coming up, a few quick questions straight from what we just covered. 4 options each. I'll give you a few seconds to think before each answer. Ready? Here we go. Question 1. In what year was the Wilderness Act signed into law? A. 1954. B. 1964. C. 1974. D. 1984. The correct answer is B. 1964. Question 2. What does the word untrammeled mean in the context of the Act? A. Open for heavy logging. B. Not controlled or heavily manipulated. C. Covered with roads and buildings. D. Reserved only for hunting. The correct answer is B. not controlled or heavily manipulated. Question 3. Who was the executive secretary of the Wilderness Society and a central figure in drafting the bill? A. John Muir, B. Howard Zahniser, C. Lyndon B. Johnson, D. Theodore Roosevelt. The correct answer is B. Howard Zahniser. Question 4. What was the name of the system the Wilderness Act created? A. The National Forest Protection Network, B. The National Wilderness Preservation System, C. The Federal Wildlands Reserve, D. The American Conservation Corridor. The correct answer is B. The National Wilderness Preservation System. Question 5. About how many acres were included in the first designation under the Act? A. More than 9 million acres. B. About 1 million acres. C. About 50 million acres. D. More than 110 million acres. The correct answer is A. More than 9 million acres. That's a wrap on this one. Thanks for sticking with us all the way through, quiz and all. If you liked it, hit subscribe so the next episode lands automatically. I'm Cyril, this was the Quiz Fix, and we'll be back soon with another true story worth knowing.